The Hammer Forum is a series of public discussions about current social and political issues that matter to our community. In the past year, we've looked at U.S.-Mexican relations, the future of newspapers and journalism, the failure of the banking system, Afghanistan, the deterioration of U.S.-Russian relations, the stimulus plan, torture and the rule of law, Pakistan, gridlock in L.A., and militant hate groups across America. We consider this a public service to be able to provide a place where people can discuss the issues of the day with leading experts in their fields. And we consider it important that we provide this free to the public. Tonight we have two brilliant speakers, legal scholar Tobias Wolff and civil rights attorney Eva Jefferson Paterson. They're here with us to discuss marriage equality in California and the United States. Our moderator is Ian Masters, who will introduce our guests. Ian is a BBC-trained broadcast journalist who's covered national security affairs for public radio for over 25 years. He's the host of Background Briefing and Live from the Left Coast, which can be heard Sundays on KPFK 90.7 FM. Ian's been a senior fellow at UCLA's Center for Strategic and International Affairs and the UCLA Center for International Relations, and he was a consultant to the Center for National Security Studies at Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. Please join me in welcoming Ian Masters.
You guys sit in the car. Okay. Thank you all, and thank you, Claudia, and all of you for coming here tonight to try and get some clarity on how it is that in the 21st century, in the land of the free and the home of the brave, we have to even discuss why some Americans have to wait for equal rights, let alone have to organize campaigns, raise money, and argue over strategies. But here we are. Our distinguished guest tonight, Tobias Barrington Wolff, will address us first for about 15 minutes to provide some background and context in terms of the struggle for gay rights in America and the recent reversal in California, where there is now a division in the marriage equality movement itself over how to overturn Proposition 8. Following Tobias, Eva Jefferson Paterson will speak for about 15 minutes to examine how and why opponents of Prop 8 failed in the last election and what should be done to overcome that defeat in the next election or the next one after that in 2012. We will then have a discussion amongst us before opening up for extensive questions from you. And since the senior advisor to the Courage Campaign and co-founder of Camp Courage is in the audience, we should have a very lively exchange with her and those supporters of Equality California's conflicting strategy. Already, Eva Paterson has set me straight for parroting the often repeated analysis in the mainstream press that it was the failure of African Americans and Latinos to vote down ticket after punching the Chads for Obama in 2008 that led to the defeat of Prop 8. She made it clear from election data that the failure to stop Prop 8 cannot be blamed on black and brown folks, which should be obvious since it was those white folks in the Mormon Church who outspent and outorganized the No on 8 campaign, who responded with one of the most inept and unfocused advertising campaigns I've seen in the devious and deceptive battleground of California ballot initiative politics. Today, we are witnessing a repeat of the slash and burn strategy of well-funded falsehoods, as the Democrats appear to be blindsided by a barrage of lies and distortions about healthcare reform, inflamed by the Pravda of the Republican right, Fox News, and allowed to go unchallenged by the mainstream media who faithfully report the other side of the story, even if it is devoid of logic, reason, and truth. By the way, we did invite Ken Starr, who is counsel for the Yes on 8 campaign, to join us tonight, but he was busy. The good news is that my daughter's generation, the 25-year-olds and under, are so over this. They are totally post-race and sexual orientation. But ironically, as our society evolves towards a more enlightened future, those that make the laws are marching lockstep in the opposite direction, with the Supreme Court on the cusp of control by 4 of the most reactionary Catholic boys you could find in the 14th century, Scalia, Thomas, Alito, and Roberts. And And I suspect these four angry men can't wait to get their hands on the same-sex marriage case in the San Francisco Federal Court being argued under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment by Ted Olson. There is a recent precedent with the Second Amendment case that overturned the DC gun ban. That case was shot by conservative activists who laid a fast track to the aforementioned four Supremes. So without suggesting Olson is insincere and Boies is naive, the consequences of going into federal court as opposed to allowing the states to incrementally overturn gay marriage bans is something to watch and certainly something to discuss here tonight. We are clearly entering an electoral environment in which debate is likely to be more strident and divisive, particularly if the economic conditions deteriorate and people become more stressed and impatient and alienated. Since it is politically incorrect to hate Obama because he is a black man, the Glenn Becks, Rush Limbaughs, and Roger Ailes are giving permission to the haters to hate Obama based on lies they are propagating that our president is a foreign-born Muslim who wants to kill Down syndrome babies and pull the plug on grandma. So the issue of marriage equality will be debated in an increasingly ugly and acrimonious arena, and one hopes the muddled campaign of the past will be replaced by a more focused message, perhaps along the lines that this is a simple struggle between tolerance and bigotry, inclusion and segregation, love and hate. But while the so-called Christian right harnesses hatred, giving the flock permission to hate those who are asking for a license to love, we should not lose sight of the absurdity of the argument that marriage is a zero-sum game when it is apparently an under-resourced institution with a 50% failure rate. Clearly, there is not enough love in the world, and while it cannot be legislated, let alone outlawed, it sure is needed. Needed by the many who live with loneliness and the millions of children who grow up in anger and despair without the tender touch of a parent who can lead them into a world of hope and happiness. Finally, for a just cause to win, the majority of the votes will have to come from those affected by the discrimination inflicted on the minority who feel most of the pain. Those least affected, I should say, by the discrimination inflicted on the minority who feel most of the pain. While the virtuous may be inclined to rise above the lies and distortions of the venal, there is a saying in America that nice guys finish last. On the other hand, you do not beat hatred with more hate. Only love can conquer hate. So on to tonight's discussion. Tobias Barrington Wolff writes and teaches civil procedure and constitutional law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and he's currently a visiting professor at Harvard Law School. Tobias has served as counsel or counsel amici curiae in many civil rights cases, including Strauss versus Horton, challenging a ballot initiative seeking to deprive same-sex couples of the right to marry, and Cook v. Gates, challenging the constitutionality of the U.S. military's don't ask, don't tell policy. He was legal advisor and LGBT policy chair to Senator Barack Obama in Obama's presidential campaign. Ladies and gentlemen, Tobias Barrington Wolff.
I have a timekeeper here. So here's what I'm going to do with my time addressing you all tonight. I'm going to say a few words by way of legal context. They got the law professor out here to do that. And then I'm going to offer some observations based upon my work as an advocate, as a scholar, and now as a participant in national politics in various ways, about where we are as a movement for LGBT equality in the United States and about where Washington is right now. We're very focused, of course, on California, and properly so, and we're going to spend a lot of our time talking about California. We can't lose sight of the relationship between what goes on in California and what goes on nationally. So first, a couple of words by way of context. There are actually 9 states now that have, in one way or another, at least in theory, at some point recognized the rights of same-sex couples to marry. The first was Hawaii, and the sort of celebrated litigation that happened in Hawaii in the early to mid-90s. For a very brief period of time, a trial court in Hawaii found that gay couples, same-sex couples, should be allowed to marry equally. That decision was interrupted and overturned by a constitutional amendment to the state constitution of Hawaii. There was a very brief window of time when a trial court in Alaska found the same thing, and the people of Alaska swung into action, and before you could even kill a caribou, there was an amendment to the Alaska Constitution that took away the right to marry for gay and lesbian couples. Next came Massachusetts. And Massachusetts, of course, is the state that really, in many people's minds, inaugurated the modern or the current moment that we're in marriage equality really being a reality for gay and lesbian couples, at least in certain states around the country. And there quickly followed, certainly in historical terms, California and New Hampshire and Vermont and Connecticut and Iowa and Maine. An extraordinary collection of states, some of them awarding marriage equality through court actions and constitutional rulings, some of them through legislative action. We also have two more states, New York and New Jersey, with governors who are fully supportive of marriage equality and legislatures where we may actually be able to get marriage equality bills passed in the next couple of months or certainly within the next election cycle. It's an interesting question where things go after those states are resolved one way or another, but we have momentum, and we have at least a certain hope and vision for what it will look like in state by state by state, getting not just the judicial recognition, but the legislative and executive recognition, which is so important for making marriage equality not just real in theory, but real in practice and lasting. Part of the story of Massachusetts is not just that the courts were with us, but that the legislature was with us. And some of you may remember in 2004, during the presidential campaign, there was an effort to amend the Massachusetts Constitution and take away that victory. And in order to beat it back, we had to get 75% of the Massachusetts state legislature to refuse to place on the ballot a amendment to the Massachusetts Constitution, and we did. An extraordinary victory. They couldn't even get a quarter of the state legislature to support writing discrimination into their Constitution, and not a single member of the legislature who supported equality was voted out of office, despite all of the challenges and all of the threats from the other side that, you know, it's political suicide to support marriage equality. There is something happening here. We're in a moment. And what I want to try to offer is a certain perspective on what that moment is. I think that anyone who wants to contribute in a serious way to a civil rights effort needs to study a little bit of history. And I'm not an historian by trade, but in my work as an advocate and as a scholar, I've tried to educate myself a bit about the history of the civil rights effort in the United States, surrounding first the eradication of slavery in the United States, and then the slow eradication of segregation and Jim Crow and the practice of lynching, which was such a terrorizing reality mostly for Black Americans, not exclusively actually, but mostly for Black Americans for such a long period of our history. And I've learned a lesson about what a civil rights movement is from that history. And it's a lesson that for me is captured by two figures who will probably be familiar to you. One of them is James Weldon Johnson, one of the early leaders of the NAACP from the first half of the 20th century, the author of the poem, which is the text of the Black National Anthem, and in many ways one of the intellectual leaders of that first great era of the civil rights movement. And the other is Martin Luther King. And I'm going to say a couple of words about both of them by way of explaining the moment that I think we're in as an advocacy movement and as a community around LGBT equality. James Weldon Johnson did a lot of anti-lynching work, and during the first third or so to the first half of the 20th century, lynching was one of the most urgent civil rights issues in the United States. Black Americans were being killed in the most brutal fashion in often very public spectacles, sometimes spectacles that involved assemblies of townspeople who would come and witness the murder and torture and dismemberment of Black people who often were either accused of crimes or simply accused of somehow breaking the rules for behavior that existed in the South and other parts of the United States as well, following the Civil War. And in his field research and in his advocacy around lynching, Johnson witnessed one particularly extraordinary event in Tennessee, a lynching of a man who was, I think, accused of some crime of disrespect. and who was killed in a town square with an audience of about 5,000 townspeople surrounding him. And as he puts it in this very affecting passage that he writes in his autobiography, this was a spectacle that was attended by women with babies in their arms and babies in their wombs. And he utters this piercing, or he writes this piercing sentence, and he says, "It was in that moment that I realized that the issue of race in America was a matter of the saving of black America's body and white America's soul." And what he understood was that the civil rights movement, as much as it was immediately and urgently about protecting black Americans from terrorism, from this domestic form of terrorism, and from discrimination, and from the endless deprivations that they were being subjected to, it was about something greater as well, or something additional as well. Greater is not the right word, but something additional. It was about who the white Americans were, who were participants in this system of violence and this system of oppression. And the insight that he had, and it is an insight which requires such extraordinary maturity and grace, I think, for someone who is in the middle of such a fight, is that while there are some people who are sadists and sociopaths and who will take the ideology of the moment as an occasion to lash out and beat those who are less powerful than they, and that is certainly part of what went on during the era of lynching and Jim Crow. A lot of the people who are caught up in and participants in that system are, in most respects that we can recognize, good people. And part of what you cannot escape if you study the history of race relations and the civil rights movement in the United States is indeed that there were a lot of very good people who said and did terrible things. And that's a conundrum. That's a challenge for anybody who wants to take this history seriously, to understand how that could be and to understand what it means when a society, or at least large numbers of the people in a society, are caught up in an ideology, a historical moment in which they participate in terrible, terrible crimes, and yet are not heartless, amoral people. And Johnson's contributions to the early civil rights movement focused in part on those lessons. And in many respects, I believe that Martin Luther King's focus on nonviolence was, in some sense, the apotheosis of that insight. Because the philosophy and the principle of nonviolence that Martin Luther King so courageously adhered to, at great peril to himself throughout his advocacy career, is a philosophy which says that in order to effectuate change, it is important to understand and to reach out to your oppressors, and to be prepared not to capitulate to them and not to compromise on the issues that are really important, but nonetheless not to fail to recognize the humanity even of those who are engaging in such oppressive actions towards you. And it was that insight, I think, which made the civil rights movement under King's leadership and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the others he worked with so powerful, and that galvanized the nation because, in fact, white America discovered that it had something to learn. And that was, I think, one of the turning points in the civil rights movement, was when white America began collectively to recognize that they had something to learn. And so one of the questions that I think we can ask about the LGBT movement is, what is it that we have to teach America? And what is it that is the sort of saving moment that we can offer to those who are, in some instances, saying and doing terribly oppressive things towards us? And I think part of the answer to that question has to do with shame. And this insight, for what it is worth, came very clear to me at a moment in 2004. I was in a car listening to NPR, of course, and the radio was broadcasting the debates in the Iowa legislature of the Iowa anti-marriage amendment, which was one of this avalanche of amendments that were passed in the 2004 election cycle. And one member, senior member of the Ohio legislature, there was a clip from his presentation. And he began speaking. And this was a man who was clearly speaking from the heart and had this extraordinary, a sort of tremor in his voice and an extraordinary, genuine affect about him. And he stood up in support of this terrible anti-marriage amendment. And what he said was, I've been married to my wife for 30 years, or however long it was, a very long time, 30 years. And he said, his voice shaking, and I don't think that I should have to be ashamed of that fact. And I stopped and I thought, you know, I don't have any understanding of what leads that man to that moment when his deeply affecting explanation for why he needs to vote for this anti-marriage amendment is the threat of shame in conjunction with the fact of his 30-year marriage. But I had better start trying to understand it, because if I don't understand why that man said that, then I am not understanding the people that I need to be reaching, and I'm not understanding the people that I need to be in a conversation with. And I think that part of what is distinctive about the lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender experience, and part of why it makes sense to talk about LGBT folks as part of a community, is that we have a shared experience of contending with shame, and of having to fight against and resist and go through as a very personal crucible a message of shame about our sexual identities, about our sexuality, about our experience with love and with affection and with physicality that comes, whether it's from family members or from religious leaders or just from the sort of pervasive gestalt sense of the media or the school where you go. All of us, I think, have some passage that we have to travel with this idea of sexual shame. And I think that overcoming this challenge of sexual shame is part of the lifelong project of coming out and of being who we are as LGBT men and women. And I think it is in that journey that all LGBT people share that we have something incredibly important to offer to the rest of America. Because part of what characterizes so much of the virulent hatred that we encounter and so much of the almost, you know, irrational or unthinking resistance to the dignity of ourselves as persons and of our relationships, I think is bound up with some kind of experience of sexual shame. And of course, a lot of opposition to LGBT equality gets expressed in the United States in religious terms. And that's a very important dimension along which to think about the issue as well. But the religious ideas that catch fire and that have purchase, catch fire and have purchase because they're speaking to something in the people that are listening. And just as the civil rights movement for Black Americans helped to teach white America about its relationship with brutality and violence, and what kind of society we wanted to be in relation to our own dignity as persons, I think that the LGBT equality movement has something to teach all of America about overcoming sexual shame and about resisting sexual shame and having it not have to be a part of our relationships or our experience as sexual adults. And it's a lesson that I think America has to learn, perhaps even more so than a lot of our peer nations around the world, because anxiety and shame around sexuality seems to be a part of the vernacular of America. And I think, perhaps ironically and counterintuitively, it is the very people who are often the targets of that message who are best situated to help the people who are perpetuating that message understand where it's coming from and understand what they themselves have to learn. So that's my first observation about where we are as a movement. Second observation I'll make very quickly, especially since my little time thing's about to run out, and it's about national politics and where we are as a community and as a movement on the national political scene. And here I want to invoke what will perhaps be a deliberately provocative parallel, but I think it's not inappropriate, which is that I think that what you're seeing in Washington now, particularly in Congress, but also in some ways in the Obama administration, is a sort of translation of the very familiar gay panic defense. The gay panic defense, you all might be aware, is this terrible recurring trope in criminal prosecutions where people who assault or even kill gay or lesbian or gender variant or transgender people will say, well, I have a reason for why I did that, right? This gay person, this transgender person started getting too close to me, and they started coming on to me, and they started making advances to me, and suddenly they started presuming that they could be in my space, and suddenly they started presuming that they could have some kind of sexual interchange with me, and he grabbed my butt, and he grabbed my crotch, as though gay people survive in America by going around grabbing the butts and crotches of random men they meet on the street. And that's why I took a swing at him, and that's why I reacted in a violent fashion. And it happens more often than we would like to admit that people get off for and escape criminal liability for really serious behavior by invoking this gay panic defense. Well, you're hearing a variant of this in Washington right now. You're hearing a variant of this explanation for why Congress cannot move with greater speed and with greater courage in fulfilling their promises of their platform and fulfilling the promises that they make when they ask for our money, and in fulfilling the promises that we have been hearing from the party as an explanation for why we need to remain loyal to the party for years and years and years. It's that there's something terrifying about getting too close to these gay issues. And there are going to be these terrible consequences, and there's going to be electoral consequences, and that's why we have to beat you over the head. And that's why we have to delay on the progress that we are promising you, because terrible things are going to happen if you get too close to us. There's a panic. It's not our panic, it's the panic of voters, but it's just the reality we have to deal with. And that is what we can no longer tolerate, and that's what we can no longer be patient with. Legislative change takes time. And I am not naive about the work that it's going to take to lay the groundwork for the repeal legislatively of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, the repeal of the Defense of Marriage Act, all of the extraordinarily important statutes that we need to enact. But it's not going to happen at all if we continue allowing our party, or the party that many of us probably subscribe to get away with this gay panic defense, and to get away with saying that there is an excuse for continuing to be complicit in the abuse of 12 million Americans who are loyal members of, most of them, of this party, and who have not yet been treated with the respect and dignity that they deserve. And I will say, where the Obama administration is concerned, there are two very important facts, I think, which we have to keep as part of the discussion. Number one, the administration has done a lot more than they ever get credit for on LGBT equality in the last 8 months. And number two, it is nowhere near enough. It is nowhere near enough. And as much as I know and love and believe deeply in our president and know where his thoughts and his values and his principles and his commitments are on LGBT equality, he has been telling us for years that the way that change happens is that you elect people who are prepared to get behind change, and then you push them to do it. And if we want to respect and honor our president, we need to do what he's been telling us to do, which is to push him very hard. And I'll close by saying that California, in some sense, presents a wonderful sort of test case for the issue of this gay panic defense, because the Congress is going to introduce next week, Representative Jerry Nadler in New York is going to introduce apparently a repeal bill for the Defense of Marriage Act, right? And my understanding of this bill, the drafts of it that I have seen being circulated, is that this repeal is going to get rid of the Defense of Marriage Act, give full federal recognition and treatment to the marriages of same-sex couples who can marry in, we hope, 6 states, including the 18,000 folks who married here in California, but not give federal recognition to domestic partnership and civil union benefits. Why is that? Well, because we don't want to be writing that parallel, separate but equal system into federal law and taking one of the best arguments that we have about why civil unions are not good enough off the table. Right? It's a terribly difficult decision because it means that lots of people, including anybody who's joined under AB 205 here in California, will not get the federal benefits that they deserve. But it's a decision that we need to confront in asking what is the best way to continue putting pressure on at the state level to get marriage equality in as many states as we can, as quickly as we can. And in California, where we have this extraordinary, as Ian pointed out, this extraordinary circumstance of the 18,000 couples who got married during the sort of grace period between May and November, and then everybody else who's suddenly not allowed to get married, it will help to place all that more, in all that sharper relief, the unsustainability and the absurdity of that circumstance here in California. But only if we take the message from California that we're going to be developing over the next 2 to 4 years and make it a part of the national conversation as well, and use it to put pressure, including using our dollars as well as our voices, to no longer be willing to accept the gay panic defense from the national legislature as a reason for delay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tobias. Eva Jefferson Paterson has campaigned for civil rights for more than 3 decades. She is the president and founder of the Equal Justice Society and worked at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights for 26 years, 13 of them as executive director. She co-founded and chaired the California Coalition for Civil Rights for 18 years and was a leading spokesperson in the campaign against the anti-immigrant Proposition 187 and Proposition 209, and was a leading spokesperson for the No 154 campaign, playing a pivotal role in the broad coalition that decisively defeated Ward Connolly's anti-affirmative action Proposition 54. As a 20-year-old student leader at the time of turmoil, Eva Jefferson Paterson was catapulted into the national spotlight when she debated Vice President Spiro Agnew on live television. Dubbed the peaceful warrior for fostering nonviolent protest in the aftermath of the 1970 shooting of students demonstrators at Kent State University, she was called to testify before Congress. Eva served as vice president of the ACLU's National Board for 8 years and chaired the boards of Equal Rights Advocates and the San Francisco Bar Association. Ladies and gentlemen, Eva Jefferson Paterson.
Good evening. I'm really happy to be here. A friend of mine in Northern California talks about something called physical solidarity, and I think that's why I'm here today, because there are a lot of misconceptions about the role of the African American community and of the Christian community in the passage of Proposition 8, and I'm here to give physical testimony to the lie of some of that. So I want to tell you who I am. I'm a lawyer. You may dislike that more than the fact that I'm Christian. I'm a straight black Christian. I'm an activist. I went to Northwestern. My friend Barb Smith is here. She's the head of American Cinematheque, and we go back to the day. I understand there's something called a purple mafia in Hollywood of Northwestern people, so I want to let you know I'm here. I'm also, used to be the chair of an organization called Equal Rights Advocates, which was an organization that dealt with feminist issues. And back in, I think, the 80s, we founded something called the National Center for Lesbian Rights, which was a project of the Equal Rights Advocates. And so I just want to give my credentials here, so you're not thinking that all black people are enemies of the LGBT community. I'm a tremendous fan of the fabulous Kate Kendall. She's on, as is Tobias, is on the board of my organization, the Equal Justice Society. She's just fabulous. She really gets the intersection between race and sexuality issues, and I think that's important, and that's something I'm going to talk about in a bit. I'm also a veteran of the initiative wars. Ian alluded to some of the battles I've been involved in. For many people in the LGBT community, this is your first foray into kind of misguided democracy, and I'm sure that's going to come back to haunt me someday in some YouTube clip. But the misguided democracy of the initiative process. Many of my LGBT friends said they were stung by the fact that the majority could take away rights, and you just saw people crying and despondent on election night when so many of us were happy about Obama's election but disconsolate because of the denial of rights that was embodied in the passage of Proposition 8. But this has been going on for decades in California. I can just tell you some of the initiatives I've been personally part of. Proposition 1 took away the right of school districts to move kids around, to desegregate school districts. We fought that in court. We lost. There are many parallels to the Proposition 8 situation. That was horrifying. Proposition 187 tried to take away rights from undocumented people, rights to medical care, education, and the like. That battle was won in the courts. That was fantastic. There was also an initiative that made English the official language in California, a direct slap to many Latinos and to Asian Americans in the state. Proposition 209, the initiative I worked most closely with, took away the right of state agencies to desegregate educational institutions, the contracting process, or employment. And this has had a devastating effect on our state institutions. I entered UC Berkeley Bolt Hall in 1972. There were 30 African Americans in my class. The year after affirmative action was eliminated in California, there was 1 black student in the entering class at UC Berkeley. I believe this last year there were only 8 black students in the entering class. If you've studied sociology, you know that one predictor of how you're going to do in your life is the educational attainment of your parents. And if you're keeping people of color, Latinos, African Americans, Filipinos, some Asian American groups, if you're keeping us out of the professional schools, that's going to have a negative ripple effect on our ability to get ahead in society. Yet, this was taken away by the voters. We fought that in court, we lost. So there are a lot of parallels to what's happened to other communities in California and what's happened to the LGBT community. This is old history in California. This is how business is done. Well, there is some good news, and some of the good news I want to share and I want to share with you so you can think about whether or not you want to try to repeal, or we want to try to repeal Proposition 8 in 2010 next year, or what I think is a better idea in 2012. We beat Proposition 54, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we did that. We did polling on it, we did message discipline, we kept our campaign together, but I'll talk more specifically about the relevance of that to what we're going to do about Proposition 8 in a minute. I've been very involved in the quest for marriage equality. I remember after Mayor Newsom allowed same-sex marriages in California, I was asked to be at a press conference there because I think all throughout the state we think it's very, very important not just to have LGBT people standing up speaking for this, but to have viable coalition partners from other parts of the community to speak up. So I was there. We did an amicus brief in the marriage cases after it was challenged, and then I was at City Hall, I think it was on May 17th, when the California Supreme Court struck down the ban against same-sex marriage. People crying on the steps and crying in the rotunda. It was just exquisite. We also did an amicus brief in the challenge to Prop 8. You should get a copy of it. Tobias wrote a masterful, brilliant, moving piece that you can get at our Equal Justice Society website. He was just great. And we were standing outside the California Supreme Court on the morning that the decisions came down, and all of us knew that the Supreme Court was going to do the bad thing, do the wrong thing. But we just all started weeping when the court basically upheld Proposition 8. It was just so tragic to see people there who felt that the state of California and the justice system had spat in our collective faces. So I just want to let you know that after the election, many people said that black people voted disproportionately for Proposition 8. That's just not true, and I'll talk about why that isn't true in a minute. Now, here's my connection to Proposition 8. I was confident it would lose. You may recall at the beginning of the polling, it was woefully and overwhelmingly unpopular. So I thought, oh, I don't need to do much on this. This is going to go down. And I think a lot of us felt this way, if we're honest with ourselves. Now, what I also know from the initiative wars is that money is critical. On Proposition 209 in 1996, we were neck and neck at Halloween, and it looked like we were going to defeat Proposition 209. This was the Anti-Affirmative Action Initiative. The right wing poured, and this seemed like big money at the time, they poured $2 million in at the end. The Democratic Party, I think, gave us $1.50 at the end. So we were outgunned, and we lost. We could have won, but we lost. We also lost because the campaign split in half. And you need to hear this. We did the kind of crazy thing that Californians often do. The North split from the South. People were tripping about egos. It wasn't about anything, but we know we can fight really vigorously about nothing. And that's exactly what we did, and that very much contributed to our defeat. We also came up with just a crazy commercial that made us feel really, really good, but it turned off the persuadables, and that's who you're targeting. And one of the messages I want to give to you tonight is that you have different messages for different communities. This was our ad to get people to vote for affirmative action, and you're going to see how insane it was. Remember David Duke? Somebody said he threw his hood into the ring trying to run for office. Well, he came out in favor of Proposition 209, so we went, this is great. We're going to have this commercial saying basically, if you're against affirmative action, you're a member of the Ku Klux Klan. That made us feel so good. They were like burning crosses. Look at this ad that we put on. Now, how effective do you think that ad was to people who were in the middle of the road? They went, oh, so my views are seen as those of a racist Klan person? Forget you. We're voting for Proposition 209. So one critical message is about messaging. There are different messages to different audiences. The message that will move the advocates of affirmative action is a very different message that will move somebody who's kind of ambivalent about it. Same analysis with Proposition 8. It's important to have feel-good messages for LGBT folks and people who support LGBT folks, but that may not be the best message to get to the persuadables. And at the end of the day, that's who you've got to get, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. So I'm all weeping on Election Day. I don't know about you, this is an aside, but when Obama came out into Congress yesterday, I just cried like a baby. I still can't quite accept the fact that a black man, a biracial man, is the president. It's still stunning. I meant getting my nails done, being all shallow and have the headphones on and everybody's all, oh, and I'm like, oh. And then I'm screaming at the Republicans. They were glad to see me go in that salon when it was over. But anyway, I never thought that Obama was going to win. In fact, I'm making a movie about Obama called Presidential Race. We started the film in 2007. The premise was why America will never elect a black president. Well, what can I say? I kind of blew it. But what I see, and this is another kind of a sidelight, but I think the people who I thought couldn't vote for the black president probably didn't, and I think they're just flipping out now. Do you think they would have yelled liar at a white president? Do you think they would have called Laura Bush, at least in public, a bitch? I mean, all these things are going on. I think people are just undone by this black man, this brilliant black man. But that's another topic. When he got elected, we wept, we wept, we cried. It was just exquisite, exquisite. But then we also heard that Proposition 8 was passing. I stayed at work a little bit late. I was going to go over to my friend's house to watch the election. And this, what I'm going to say next sounds like a stereotype, and please forgive me because it's not meant to. But I came out of my garage and two men walked by me who appeared to be partners. And they just glared at me, and I went, oh my God, because by then the lie had gotten out that 70% of black folks had voted for Proposition 8. And I was just going, oh no, I'm not homophobic. Please don't look at me like that just because I'm black. So all weekend I went around like to Sur La Table and all these places, and I'm looking at people who I think are gay, and I'm going, please, please, I didn't do this. I didn't do this. I hope this isn't offensive because it's really not meant to be. And if it is, I'm sorry, but every person I saw who I thought was gay, I was trying to engage them, kind of, please, please, I'm not a homophobic asshole. And then I'm driving home and I'm going, wait a minute, the black people I know did not vote for Proposition 8. So I'm the queen of email. So I started emailing 5 people, 10. By the end of the day, it was about 100 black folks going, look, we've got to stand up and say we did not vote for this. It's very important for LGBT folks, who are often people of color, to know that the black community did not do this. Now, the exit polling that came out seemed to indicate that 70% of black folks voted for Proposition 8, but that was just a few districts. The later analysis that was done indicated that 58%, I think we voted like 58, 59% in favor of Proposition 8. I think the electorate voted about 56%. So we were not that out of line. Here's something that you need to understand, though. The people who, I think what was more indicative of voting for Proposition 8 was your formal religious affiliation. I have friends who were told that if they voted for Proposition 8, or if they, I was on a radio show, Kate Kendall, she really owes me. She had me doing Christian talk radio, and she said, oh, it'll only be a half hour. It was the longest hour of my life. People calling in saying, I'm going to go to hell, and I'm Christian. I know the Bible. I can quote that stuff back. We don't care what the Bible says, blah, 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 blah. But on the serious side, there are people who have been told, and you need to feel this. There are people who have been told they will go to hell if they support gay causes. Let me say that again. There are people who have been told by their ministers that they will go to hell if they support gay causes. My next door neighbors, I love them, but we fight. They're African American. We fight about this. They say, I bet you have gay friends. I said, yeah, I do. But they kind of thought that was like, oh, that's really odd. But I don't know that many people in the audience come in contact with religious people who are being told by people who they think are agents of God that to believe and to support LGBT causes puts your mortal soul in danger. Logical arguments are not going to initially overcome that. You've got to feel that and know that. I think it very much ties in with what Tobias said. There are people who are generally good who do hideous things. And you've got to understand this, and this is something that we have to overcome when we are on the road to repealing Proposition 8, because to me it's just a matter of when, not if. So after I saw people just so mad at black folks, I decided, well, better get on the road, start telling folks we're not all evil. So I came down here to LA and did a talk, and then I went to the LGBT building in San Francisco, and I was just terrified because I thought people were just going to like beat me up. And people were like initially very hostile looking, but by the end they kind of got it and understood that a lot of black folks are supportive of LGBT causes. Okay. To finish up quickly. What I really want to focus on is the timing of the repeal. Now, here's a couple of things. Emotions and feelings are very, very important. We were all devastated by the passage of Proposition 8, but that's not the way you determine the timing of the repeal. I went to law school because I liked Perry Mason, if I had a tattoo on my arm, it would say "Born to Sue." I love suing people. It's fun. I love the outfits. I love noticing a deposition and someone has to come to my office and answer questions. It's fabulous. And when I first started practicing law, there weren't that many black women. There aren't that many now. And the judge would just like perk up. And because you could speak the Queen's English, they were like, who are, I'm telling you, they'd just be tripping. You know, they go, you'd be sitting where the lawyers were. They go, oh, that's just for the lawyers, not the defendants. I am a lawyer. And once somebody said that, they have to rule for you. Do you know what I'm saying? You work what you can. So I didn't know that I'd have to learn election law in order to be a civil rights advocate. But because so much of law is made in the initiative process, I've had to learn how to run political campaigns. I once said to someone that running California is like running a country, and they said, no, it's like organizing something in Western Europe. And that's really very true. It's an enormously diverse state, so many different pockets and regions, so much just sheer terrain, and it's very hard to organize. I don't have much time left, and I'll talk really fast. There is a science to elections. You have to do polling, and I know people, no, we just want to repeal Proposition 8. We don't care. That way is madness. You have to figure out what the polls are saying. You've got to figure out if there's money to fund your campaign. You've got to figure out if the people who are on your side are unified. You have to figure out what the right messages are. It's not just what makes us feel good. We're already going to vote against Proposition 8. We need to figure out who those people were who voted for it and what percentage of them we can bring over to our side and what messages will work with them. It's just not what we feel. That isn't going to get it. The feeling is what motivates us to be analytical and strategic and smart about repealing Proposition 8. We also have to make sure, though, that our messages have integrity. And let me give you an example. In Proposition 187, this was the anti-undocumented people initiative. And one of the arguments people wanted to persuade us to use was this. If those undocumented kids aren't in school, they're going to be out robbing your neighborhood. Now, that may, if I'm lying, I'm flying, people wanted that argument to be used, and it probably would have been effective, but it has no integrity. So you just don't use messages that will work. The messages also have to be something that you can live with down the road. Here are lessons from Proposition 54. We actually won. We've been losing, and we won. What the initiative was about was it was going to prohibit the collection of any racial, ethnic, or gender-based data. Ward Connerly thinks that we're in a colorblind society. He thinks collecting any racial data is just terrible. That would totally disable me as an employment discrimination lawyer because, for example, in San Francisco, there were no Asian American officers in the San Francisco Fire Department. You would think in a city with as diverse an Asian American population as San Francisco, there'd be plenty of Asian American officers. There are negative stereotypes about Asian Americans and leadership. And so we feel that that very much contributed to the actual zero number of Asian American officers. If I couldn't collect that data, I would think that of course there are Asian American officers in San Francisco. But with the data, I was able to prove the reality, and I could then be born to sue. So we knew what Connerly was all about, but he called it racial privacy. The right wing is brilliant at coming up with these little phrases that are lies, but death panels, we're going to kill Granny. It's a big lie, but death panel gets people all freaked out and gets people to be against the health care proposals that are out there. So he called this the Racial Privacy Initiative. Now, what was very helpful is that Bill Lockyer was the Attorney General at that time, and he knew that this was a lie, so he would not allow it to be called the Racial Privacy Initiative. That helped us quite a bit. Second thing that you need to do is get great consultants and then don't second guess them. A friend of mine said his father told him that the best thing you can do when you're employing somebody is to hire, the best thing you can do when you're running a business is to do great hiring, to take a lot of time on the front end and then keep the people. Now, what happens in campaigns is when things start going the wrong way, people say, fire the consultants, and people are second-guessing the consultants, and madness ensues. Well, let me give you an example. We hired a consultant, and I love saying this, named David Axelrod. He was our consultant on Proposition 54. There were people on our campaign who advised us to fire him. This was in 2003. That Axelrod, he doesn't know what he's doing. And luckily, we did not listen to those people, thank God, because we won and we did a good job. But what I understand from the campaign around Proposition 8 is that people were second-guessing the consultants, oh, get rid of them, blah, blah, blah. But you don't do that. Take a lot of time at the front end and pick the right people to run the campaign, and then resist the urge to change horses midstream. Governance is another very important problem and issue in this area. You need a large steering committee of people who are from all parts of the community to help guide the campaign, but you need a very small executive committee to make the decisions on a day-to-day basis. And you've got to make sure that you're not firing the people and getting mad at them. Somebody once said that if the left had a firing squad, it would be a circle. And I think that's exactly what we do. We turn on each other, we're fighting with each other, we fight more with each other often than with other people. You need to also have a very large and expanding coalition of people to support the effort to repeal Proposition 8. So here's my conclusion. I think 2010 is too early a time to repeal Proposition 8, and I say it for this reason. The community around repealing Proposition 8 is very deeply and bitterly divided. You don't want to go into a campaign with people feeling like they have a gun at their head, and that's why they are involved in trying to repeal Proposition 8. If you've got significant people like Kate Kendall and other folks who say, wait, I think you should wait. I think it's a real mistake to go ahead. I've also heard, and I don't know if this is apocryphal or anecdotal or true, but that some of the big money people are really tired and don't want to pony up money right now. If you don't have money, you're not going to win. This is all about money. It's a media war, an air war, and a ground war. You want to do grassroots, get out the vote, but because this is like organizing Western Europe, you have to have a very sophisticated media approach, and that takes huge, huge bucks. From what I can understand, the polling indicates that not that many people have shifted their position on Proposition 8. If that's the case, you don't want to walk in to get defeated again. Can we take this again, of getting beaten down again? And to me, I'm not someone who says, well, just the fight's important. It's just important that we fight. It's important to fight, but it's important to fight smart. For example, Proposition 209 was passed in 1996. I was depressed for a year after that. When you come out of these defeats, you just look around at the people on the street and you go, are you the person who voted against me? Is it you? And I'm sure people, I'm sure those people who saw me driving out of my garage looked at me and went, it's you. And it's very disheartening to have your rights taken away by your fellow citizens. But we have been doing polling on the repeal of Proposition 209 since 1996. The votes aren't there, the messages aren't there. We just found a message this summer that we think will work. And this is 13 years later. I am a relentless person, and believe me, I want Proposition 209 overturned, but it didn't make sense to put it on the ballot, even though we think we have the money to do it, until we had the message that would work. And I don't think the repeal of Proposition 8 will take that long, but what I'm saying is you can't just go on emotion. You've got to be scientific and smart and strategic about how we move forward on this. The last point I would make is this. There were religious people and there were Black and Latino people who did vote for Proposition 8. One of the things that I've heard said repeatedly is that the LGBT community needs to reach out to these communities, people of color, the religious community. To my knowledge, that's just been started, but that really needs to be done not just to get Proposition 8 overturned, but to really make people our allies and to really move people's hearts and minds not to be bigoted and not to be homophobic. It's my understanding that that work has not been done. I had dinner last night with Tom Sines, who's a local Los Angeles man who is the president and general counsel of the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund. It's a national organization like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that advocates for the rights of Mexican Americans. He asked me to tell you all that he is eager to be involved in this fight, to get people, Latinos around the state and around the country, to be supportive of the repeal of Proposition 8. But that probably won't be done by next year. So there's a lot of work to be done. It's very, very, very frustrating to have to live with such horrors from your fellow citizens. Believe me, I've been through it for years. You don't get over it, but you realize in order to be really an effective advocate, you've got to approach this in a scientific manner. The last thing I would say, and I have to say this to myself as well, is that people need to check their personal and institutional egos at the door. Easier said than done, but there are going to be people who have annoyed you, but they're your allies, and you've got to work with them. Now, sometimes there are people you would just like to slap because you're so tired of them and their nonsense, but you've got to kind of check that stuff at the door because we don't have time for the circular firing squad. Anyway, I'm glad to be in Southern California, and I'm not into that, oh, I'm from Northern California, we're better. People are kind of over that stuff, and I ate at the Napa Valley Grill the other night, so I guess you guys like Northern California as well. I think Proposition 8 will be defeated. Ian alluded to this, and I'll say it in a less polite way. The people who are for Proposition 8 are dying. That's another thing. If you look at the demographics, I'm 60 myself, so I'm talking about people my age and a little bit older. But the people who don't get it, they're going to be gone. Maybe Obama has the death panels. I don't know. But younger people are the ones who are going to be around and who get it. So it's hard to be smacked in the face by the voters, but it's happened to us many, many times, and we're going to win, but we have to be smart about it. Thank you so much.
So there's no way escaping the fact that it's going to be a lot of work, whether it's 2010 or 2012. And what do you think the percentages are of the people that you have to persuade? There's obviously a hardcore group that you can't persuade, and you can't count on them all dying. So, so what do you think you're dealing with in terms of a constituency? What does that constituency look like? Not your allies, but the people, the persuadables, I think was the word that you used, Eva.
Look at the Black folks who go to church, who voted for Proposition 8, because we did vote by about 3% more than the electorate for Proposition 8. So I think you need to get to more black folks, Latinos as well, heavy Catholic constituency. Many priests saying, not all priests aren't homophobic, that's not the case at all, but you've got people who, Tobias, you've got people telling their parishioners that this is a bad thing. You also saw all the money coming in from the Mormon Church, and that was done at the last minute. You also had robocalls from Obama saying, I don't support same-sex marriage. And he wasn't in favor of Proposition 8, and that was done at the last minute. I think that confused a lot of people
Just to be clear,
as well.
Not robocalls from
I'm
Obama,
sorry.
but robocalls in which people claimed to be using Obama as a reason to vote
Exactly.
for Prop 8.
Exactly.
Rather important distinction.
Exactly.
So,
And can I just say, by the way,
Yeah.
on that, this is one of those, Eva's exactly right, that people of color and people of faith are two of the constituencies that we need to be reaching much more actively. And this is one of those places where there's a difficult issue about meeting people on their own ground. Because one of the discussions that is very active in LGBT advocacy and political and other circles is about language and about whether you call LGBT equality a, quote, a civil rights issue. And this is a very difficult, and it provokes a lot of very difficult and sharp disagreements, because there are people of color who don't like that association and who might well be very supportive, at least supportive of a lot of what we want them to be supportive of. But they have this reaction when you try to, what they experience as appropriate a language and a history which is distinctively theirs and not translating because there's some suggestion that the experience of LGBT oppression is somehow the same or just as bad as the history of racism and slavery in the United States. And for a lot of LGBT folks, myself included, this feels like a terrible rebuke, because there's a lot of things that we call civil rights issues in the United States, and why is this one the one that is getting singled out for this kind of different treatment of language? And if we want to reach folks, there has to be a conversation in which we both come in a genuine way to the table and say, here's my experience, and here's why the legacy of the civil rights movement seems to be an appropriate point of reference for what we're trying to do. But also really listen and hear people's own, the people that you're trying to reach, what do they have to tell you about what this language means to them and how they might be movable? Because if you're trying to move people, you have to move them in the ways that they're prepared to move, not in the ways that you would like them to move. And recognizing when there is a gap between those two things is really hard and takes a lot of maturity, but I think it's one of the important things we need to do.
and does the obvious parallels between marriage equality and overturning the ban on interracial marriage, does that resonate?
No, not yet. Not really, because people just see it as so different. They really do. And that groundwork needs to be done. My friend Ben Jealous runs the NAACP. He and Julian Bond, who is the chair of the board, they both were against Proposition 8, yet they didn't want to push the NAA to come out with a position in favor of marriage equality because they felt it would split the board apart. And Ben is a vigorous advocate of this. So that's why I think it's going to take more than 1 year to really move people. And as I was thinking about speaking today, I was thinking we are going to need to go to little storefront black churches.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are black people going to churches. We go very disproportionate to the general population. And it's almost going to be block by block talking to people and having Christians go talk to other Christians. But that work has not been done. And I'm afraid unless that groundwork is done, we'll end up with the same result.
And you know, there's another important part of this as well, and this is an issue that Eva and I have worked on together and talked about a lot, and Eva uses the language of a two-way street. How much has the LGBT community been showing up on issues of racial equality and racial justice? And I think the answer is a complicated one. It's not meant to be a sort of rhetorical, we haven't done anything. It's not the case that we haven't done anything on those issues. But as a community, as a political movement, as a legal advocacy movement, have we been vigorous advocates on issues of economic justice that disproportionately affect people of color, on prison reform issues, on urban renewal issues, which very much affect our communities? I mean, God knows that police-civilian relations is more of an urgent issue for a transgender person of color living in Philadelphia or in LA than it is for almost anybody else. But if we really want to take seriously this idea of alliances, old-style coalition politics, then that means that you show up for other people's issues because they are issues that are important to them. And that's what gives you the credibility and the ability to expect them to show up for your issues. And I think that we as an LGBT community have, that there's room for improvement on our presence and our level of support on issues of racial equality and racial justice and economic justice.
But there is also in politics, perversely, because in this country so few people vote. In Australia, where I come from, you get fined if you don't vote. So the political pros, I think in many ways prefer a smaller voting pool because they can rationalize it more. So I'm curious to know whether you think a smaller voting pool would be better than a bigger one. And I imagine you'd have a bigger voting pool in 12, wouldn't you, with Obama running again, than you will in 10. So what are the advantages and disadvantages? Because now we just had a city attorney race where they spent millions and about 10 people voted. I mean, we're going to get to the point where you have to be a millionaire to run for dog catcher.
I think that's right. I think that's right. Well, I think a lot of very interesting things are going to happen in the next few years. I think it may be easier for President Obama to be more forthright about marriage equality in 2012 than he was in 2008, I hope. If we do our work correctly, I think the same demographics that came out in such big numbers for Obama will be out again, but we've got to do our work to pull them over to oppose Proposition 8. So we've got to go to the churches, get to the NAACP, go with MALDEF. So I think there are enough people to pull over, and there'll be more people will turn 21 by 2012, and my people are starting to die. So.
And another important thing to remember about what happened in the voting population in California in 2008 is that part of the media message, at least the local media message, about that this is black and brown people's fault that Prop 8 passed, was sort of bound up with this idea that, well, Obama is bringing out all these people who are going to be bad voters for us, right? The net impact of Obama's candidacy was a very positive one for defeating Prop 8 because of the youth vote. And in fact, unprecedented numbers of young people registered and came out to vote and voted in very large numbers against Prop 8. And so, I preface this by saying, unlike Eva, I am really not an expert on political organizing in California and initiative campaigns. I know what I'm good at, and I'm good at a lot of stuff, but that's not part of it. But in thinking about not just numbers of voters, but also compositions of the electorate and the ways in which you can massage it and so forth, my instinct, and maybe some of the experts can weigh in on this, is that the vote that is hardest to get out to the polls is the youth vote. And that given how important the youth vote is to this cause, the question of where the youth vote is going to be in 2010 versus 2012 is probably a really important question. And there is reason to think and hope that the youth vote will come out to re-elect Barack Obama in a way that might not be possible to replicate in 2010.
Well, unfortunately, I think unemployment is going to be a big issue. And unfortunately, the young are bearing a big brunt of that. So it doesn't look like either 10 or 12 are going to be particularly hospitable for any cause, any Democratic cause. Why did you even think you were going to win? I mean, so maybe that we can work from that.
The initial polling that I saw showed that it was going down. And as I recall, that trend continued till maybe, I'm not precise on this, maybe 2 months, a month before the actual election. But isn't that right? Like at the very beginning, it looked like it was going down. So I thought, hey, no problem, because I'm a poll-driven person. But what happened towards the end is things started shifting and tons of money came in. And money really does win the day. And the outsiders just poured in a ton of money. I understand our side put in a lot of money as well, but we weren't able to turn the tide.
And I'll tell you, I resist a little bit the way in which you sort of somewhat fatalistically said, well, 2010, 2012, they both look not so good. There is something very important that is happening. And even if it's not yet reflected in the polling about whether people who voted for Prop 8 are prepared to reconsider, you know, since the California Supreme Court's decision, we have 4 more states that by either Supreme Court decision of the state or by the legislature, and increasingly by the legislature in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine, this was done legislatively. And we're fighting the fight of our lives in Maine, by the way. One of the things that you all should be doing is giving financial support to the effort to preserve what the legislature did in Maine. We can win this fight. The polling is right on the cusp. The amounts of money involved are not huge, and they need the money. So you should be giving your money to that cause. And I don't work for them, but you should be giving your money to that cause. If we get New York and New Jersey, that's going to be huge. And we very well might get both New York and New Jersey. I think that there comes a collective sense that the tides of history are turning. And I think that matters because part of the question, how do you get somebody to do something differently from what they did before, is you give them a way to do it which allows them to keep feeling good about themselves. And trying to tell people, you did this terrible thing to us 2 years or 4 years ago, but now you can undo it, that's not necessarily a great message, because if you have to get people to sort of own up to doing a terrible thing, that's a lot to ask of somebody. But if the message is, we're living in a different time, and you know, this is, you know, ideas are shifting, and whatever happened in 2008, you know, we can all acknowledge that we're in a different moment right now. That gives people a way of doing the right thing, which doesn't require them to admit that they did something bad in 2008. And as much as we would like to tell them that they did something bad in 2008, that's not how you win their hearts and minds.
I have 2 points I want to make, and one is a kind of a dry point. And that is, at the end of the day, you make the decision based on the polling. I can have intuitive feelings about how people are going to come out to vote, but you take a poll and you find out how people are going to vote. Second point, less dry. My understanding is that most people who oppose marriage equality think they don't know a gay person. And I think they don't know. I think that's an important point. And one of the critiques I heard of the anti-Prop 8 campaign was that the faces of married couples of same-sex were not out there. I think it's important to do ground softening between now and whenever this goes on the ballot, so that people see same-sex marriages, and it's not something scary. The thing I've never understood is why people feel their marriage is threatened by same-sex marriage. I thought, if your marriage is that shaky, you know, there's nothing the LGBT community can do to harm your marriage. But I think it is important to get pictures out there of families and for people to come out to their friends so people know this isn't some scary thing. These are your neighbors. So I think there are some things we can do between now and whenever it's on the ballot that can help the possibility or enhance the possibility that this will be defeated.
Well, just a final question, because we need to get to Q&A, but there is such a thing as compassion fatigue. There's also donor fatigue. There's global warming, financial, national bankruptcy, and state implosion, civic disruption.
We get it.
So how do you make your best argument in that environment? I mean, what is, because I guarantee you that they didn't make very good arguments last time. What's the best argument?
I hate to be such a data wonk, but it's not an intuitive thing. And one of the things we did on Proposition 54 was this. We did some polling, and it turned out that the best way to defeat it was to talk about health, was to say that if you don't collect data on health, people will suffer. And the polling we did that said if you don't collect data on health, black people or people of color's health will suffer, people didn't care. That was one of those days when I just wanted to quit the practice of law and punch every person I saw on the street. No, I'm serious, because you're going, are you the person who doesn't care? You know, it's very disconcerting. So then we did some polling that indicated that if you said to white people that their health would be adversely affected if you didn't collect data, they all of a sudden come your way. So we were working with Axelrod and some other people, and they are from Chicago, and they knew the people on ER, yeah, because I think, and they were going to have some of the doctors who played doctors on TV to say, if you don't vote for this, you know, your health is going to be in trouble. And so we said, well, why don't we get like, and don't be offended, some of my best friends are white, Tobias, Barbara, I married a white man, I have nothing against white people. But we decided to try to get the whitest white person we could find to get on TV and say this. So we got C. Everett Koop, who got on and he said, if you vote for this, you will die. And we won. And that had integrity. Although I must say, because the left is so nutty, we got trash for using that. What can I say? So we need to figure out the message that will work with the persuadables. And this is a science. I don't know what the message is. I don't know what it is. Is it carpetbaggers coming in from other states trying to change California law? I don't know. But that's what some of the money needs to be used for. So, but you don't do this until you're ready. And if we're not ready in 2010, we don't do it.
Well, let's turn to somebody who's going to jump the gun, or at least according to you.
Ian?
We have a representative of the Courage Campaign, and go ahead.
You putting me in this position to go against Eva? Although I will say, Eva, you brought up, you gave me kind of one of those flashbacks. I happen to be an attorney, black female attorney, and I was in judges' chambers one time, and there were about 8 other attorneys in there. And the judge looks at me and says, so, tell me about your clients. Do they speak Ebonics?
No.
Yes.
No.
And I said, Your Honor, I don't know what you be talking about.
Go on, sis.
Right, so.
You know what I'm saying.
Yes, I do. Courage Campaign has been kind of in the spotlight as an organization that has been advocating for 2010 for the effort to repeal Prop 8. And although it's a kind of a convenient shorthand, and although many of us at the Courage Campaign think that it's winnable in 2010, what we have been doing is just, first of all, trying to make sure that the clock doesn't run out while all the progressive people talk about what we're going to do. Because at a certain point, you can't go in 2010. Mm-hmm. And that decision will have been made for you. But some of the reasons why I personally think 2010 is the time is kind of goes with what Tobias was saying. I think this is a new moment. It's a moment that is very different than even the day before Barack Obama was elected. I don't know about you, but many, many people in my family, and you heard it all over the news, when Barack Obama was elected, people thought, I never dreamed I would see this in my lifetime. How many people did you hear say that? Well, Eva said it. Didn't believe it. She was making a movie. So until it happened, many people were saying, I can't believe it. And I saw that. And then also, after Proposition 8 passed, something else happened. The black LGBT community here in Los Angeles that I've been organizing in for about 25 years, something happened that has never happened before. After Proposition 8 passed, black LGBTs took to the street in the Crenshaw district in Leimert Park.
Wow.
And marched.
Wow.
When I heard that, that was Exhibit B. Something has changed. This third thing that happened, 20 years ago, a group of black lesbians, I had founded an organization, and we were going to march in the Black History Parade. Not Gay Pride Parade, Black History Parade in Los Angeles. We marched. When we got to the grandstands where they were going to announce our name, a street that was packed, all black people that were cheering and shouting and clapping. When they saw us and they read our banner, the streets went silent. This was 1989. This year, when we marched down Crenshaw, a black LGBT contingent, we got a standing ovation.
All right.
I looked over to the side and I saw this older black woman struggle to get out of her lawn chair to give us a standing ovation. Thumbs up all the way down. What happened?
But let's
I think-
get focused, though. Because,
Okay.
Because we really need to talk about splitting the money, you know, and splitting the cause. I mean, you got to
Yes.
make a case about why it is that you want to go earlier and not join the other group and prepare the groundwork, the arguments, and more importantly, raise the money.
Well, let me be clear. I believe it has to be a united effort.
Good.
It has to be united. You can't have a piece of a community, whether the LGBT community, along with certain straight allies. It has to be a united effort. And so what I think, you know, there's so many of these elements. How do you weigh them? What are the most important ones? How do you prioritize? When you think about 2012, many of the people who came to us and said, look, we're ready to do this now. We're Obama people. We organized with Obama. Where do you think a lot of those Obama organizers are going to be in 2012? So it's certainly not black or white. And I also think that another element that you can't underestimate is the money, the people, the volunteers, the interest is catalyzed by a campaign. I mean, you've been in so many campaigns, you know that to say you're going to have this 3-year kind of going door to door and canvassing for 3 years is fairly, that's unrealistic. You certainly can have a public education campaign. So what the Courage Campaign is doing, and what we've been doing since Proposition 8 passed, is we're having trainings. We do a Camp Courage, which is based on Camp Obama, which was one of the secrets of President Obama's success in organizing millions of people. So we're organizing, we're training, and then we put the word out. We say, look, it's going to take a ton of money to just do the polling, the testing of the ballot language. What will work with the persuadables? And we said, all right, we put the word out to the community. We want to raise $100,000 in 2 weeks. Well, community responded in 6 days and raised $135,000. So what the Courage Campaign is doing is saying, all right, let's do the next step. Let's get the research. Let's get the research, let's do the testing, and that's going to be done by October 20th. So instead of just kind of waiting, we're getting the work done. It's going to be usable. it's important. It has to be done anyway. And meanwhile, we're trying to bring these sides together.
Okay, well, let's bring our guests back into the conversation here.
I don't want to fight with you either, because you know we have
Don't
more.
sue me, Eva.
No, I won't. Statute of limitations. But it sounds like you're not totally wedded to doing this, which I think is smart. And I hope that I think Equality California and other folks feel very strongly this shouldn't go forward. And I would hope you wouldn't go forward if they think it's a bad idea. But we got information on the health argument for Prop 54 way ahead of time. And you may start getting information about what messages will work now, even if we do wait till 2012, because we can start doing the ground softening now. And I wasn't proposing that you do the knocking on the door campaign stuff, but the public education and figuring out, particularly in the religious communities and the communities of color, how to bring people over to our side. Because this alludes to something Tobias said. This just isn't about Prop 8. It's about more love, and it's about getting people in the state to not be homophobic and to not make little black and brown kids who are gay feel like they're bad and full of shame. So what we're talking about is something fairly deep. So we probably, when my father died, my brothers and I were just all fighting. This happens a lot. I don't know if it's just black families or everybody. But at one point I stepped back and I realized we're not fighting about anything. There's no right or wrong. They're just different points of view. And
Hi, thank you very much, first of all, for a really stimulating evening. I've been covering this marriage equality issue for a very long time. And Tobias, I think that, you really put your finger on it in talking in terms of the gay panic defense, because what we're not talking about are all those people who at the end of as they went into the voting booth, thought about the kids being taught about gay sex as opposed to the civil rights issue. And if you look at the polling, you could see that people thought Prop 8 was discriminatory, but voted for it anyway. And part of the reason had to do with the yes on 8 argument about the kids will be taught about gay sex, which was a very strategic decision. Because Frank Schubert, who's, by the way, running the campaign, the same people who succeeded in passing Prop 8 here are, exported their campaign and are now doing the same in Maine and are going to try to do it elsewhere. But the thing is that they too realized that most of the people said, what does this have to do with me? I don't want to talk about it. It doesn't impact me. So they strategically came up with this argument about consequences, and they made it up. What are the consequences? Well, they could teach the kids about gay sex. And the whole point about when you're looking at somebody, in the face, the yes on 8 people don't see a civil rights issue. They see gay sex, period. And we don't know how to address that in terms of the question is, the question is to Tobias about this Ted Olson case, where one of the key arguments is that sexual orientation is an immutable characteristic. Do you think that, first of all, that will be a successful argument? And secondly, would saying that, gay people are born that way will be useful as a political tool in the next campaign? Because that sort of takes away that gay sex stuff.
Right.
Thank you.
So I actually think those are profoundly different questions, because the question about what is a smart legal and constitutional strategy, especially in this case, where it is almost a certainty that if we I think we're going to win before the federal district court. And that partly has to do with the fact that not we, I shouldn't say, I'm not part of that team, but the folks who brought this lawsuit drew a very fortunate judge. Chief Judge Vaughn Walker in San Francisco is just a very smart and sensible judge, and has already structured the litigation in a way which it seems to me makes clear that he wants to do what district courts do and develop a full record which will allow for a robust ruling at the district court level. Now, it's very dangerous to predict such things, but I anticipate a good outcome at the district court level. That's not where the game is, right? The game is at the appellate court level in constitutional litigation. If we win the issue in front of the Ninth Circuit, I think it is almost a guarantee that it will go up to the Supreme Court. And so in the context of this lawsuit, conversations about what is it smart to do really have to have as their principal focus the 9 men and women on the Supreme Court. And there's been a long conversation. We can talk about it a bit if folks are interested. I expressed a lot of skepticism about the judgment associated with filing this lawsuit at this particular time. I had the great privilege of filing a brief on behalf of Equality California in the case, urging the court to focus very narrowly on the circumstances which are quite distinctive surrounding Prop 8 in particular, and the irrationality and the sort of official second-class citizenship that Prop 8 represents. The immutability discussion in that context is really a prediction of what the 9 members of the Supreme Court will view as a convincing argument. And I don't think that the 9 members of the Supreme Court are prepared to find that anti-gay discrimination is inherently constitutionally suspect. Because if they, of the present Supreme Court, it would all hinge, I think, on Anthony Kennedy. And he has done some great things in his rulings. But the consequences of that would basically be a nationalization of marriage equality. And the court is a political organ, or at least it acts like one, and not just a purely judicial organ. You know, that's a long conversation too, but just descriptively, that's what the court often does. If this is going to succeed in a way which is going to stick, I think what we need to hope for is a ruling that is very narrowly focused on the distinctive circumstances in California, and that if the court could affirm a victory without, by the necessary force of that decision, meaning that marriage equality has to be instantiated in all 50 states, I think that we might be able to win. And so in that context, I'm not sure that immutability is I think it's going to be a conversation because the judge has asked for a development of a record on it, but I'm not sure whether it's a part of a winning strategy. In the political context, I've got to tell you, this is one of those hard issues, right? Because there's certainly a lot of anecdotal evidence and apparently some polling evidence that suggests that people who are hostile to LGBT equality, or we should take the T out of it actually because that raises distinct issues, but people who are hostile to LGBT equality express their hostility in terms of viewing our sexual identities as a choice. That's not the same thing as suggesting that they'll be movable if you get them to see the issue differently. They may just shift the language that they use in describing why it is that they're anti-LGBT. So I worry about focusing too much on a born that way argument. But having said that, I think that the shared experience of most people who self-identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual is that it is indeed an inherent part of our being. And if we can offer that message with integrity, then it might be an important part of a campaign if it's a part of telling our stories in a genuine fashion.
Well, but it takes the shame part of it.
Let's do another one. There.
It might. It might.
Wait for the mic there. Coming to you.
Thank you. My name is Lee Walkup. I have some arguments for the lady, and that is I'm probably a nightmare because I am older than you are. And I don't want to die before my rights are confirmed. And I'm not going to let that happen because I'm a member of several grassroots organizations that didn't exist before Proposition 8. And we came into being because our leaders told us to keep quiet and send money. And we're not going to do that again. And we're going to do it sooner, not later, I can assure you. And in regard to gay marriage, there is no gay marriage. There is no gay sex to be taught in our schools. There is marriage equality. And as long as we remember that there is marriage equality, we will not have a problem with what sex are you that are getting married. It is we are married, we are equal, marriage is marriage is marriage. So I can't emphasize enough the importance that everyone become involved. And if you aren't involved, you should be. I have been to Camp Courage, and I know Lisa. This weekend, I'm going to boot camp because I care. You have to care, and you have to consider yourself equal, and you have to consider yourself ready for marriage equality. So don't give up.
Okay. Here's the only thing that I'm saying. I feel you, and I think what you're saying is important. I'm just saying that we need to make sure that we can take this thing down. And we have to do it using some of the science of looking at polling, data, messages, and money. That's all I'm saying. I think Proposition 8 will be overturned. I'm just saying, and it sounds like the Camp Courage people and the Courage Campaign people are doing it, just be scientific and systematic about it. That's all I'm saying.
I know they are, and that's what I appreciate. Thank you.
Let's take a question here, this gentleman here in the blue shirt.
Hi. I've been following this issue very closely, and I've been privy to some recent polling that was done a few months ago, and actually the Courage Campaign helped fund them along with some other groups. And if we went to ballot tomorrow with the right language, we could win. And that is that if the voters knew the truth, which is that having same-sex marriage legalized would not force churches to marry same-sex couples, we would win. That's clearly what the polling shows. And what happened was that the Yes on 8 side ran a very effective and ruthless campaign where truth was taken hostage, and they convinced people, both of it's going to be taught in schools, that's another issue that we were not successful at dispelling. And that the churches are going to lose their tax-free status, which I don't even know that we really tried to expel. We weren't successful at it if we did. We did not have a well-organized campaign. A reason why I am sort of leaning towards 2010, if we can get the ballot language right, would be maybe that Equality California would not take a leading role. Not that they'd get in the way, but the fact is that they didn't do a very good job in Prop 8. The leadership of Equality California really wasn't capable of successfully running a ballot initiative, or at least not in a defensive position. And unfortunately, and I'm sorry to be part of the circular firing squad, but I'm also trying to be pragmatic, is that we need real leadership. We need a solid campaign director. It was sort of a campaign run by a committee, and so no one was taking responsibility, and it was, as
let's get a quick answer and then.
It's funny, you have a bifurcated system for running an effective campaign. And one is you do have to have a committee that's working with the consultant. And so there's interaction both ways. The committee has to be trusted by the constituency, and then the committee's got to help guide the consultant, and they have to go back and forth. As I stated my biases straight up. I'm a big Kate Kendall fan, and I understand that people were not so happy with her. I just think she's fabulous, so maybe I'm seeing things through starry eyes, and maybe she's a horrible person, and I've been misguided. And here's the deal. I'd love to be wrong. I would love for this to go on the ballot in 2010. I was wrong about Obama. I thought he wasn't going to get elected, and I stood up and said, look, I messed up, and maybe I'm wrong. Like I said to the sister back here, there's no way for us to prove who's right or who's wrong. If you're right, cool, because we all want this thing repealed. My considered judgment is if you've got such a split in the community, it's not the best time to go. And maybe Equality California sits it out, and maybe I come back, you know, in a year, in 2 months, and go, hey, I blew it again.
Let's take a final question here. Is there any persuadables in the audience that I'd like to get a feeling from somebody that...
Is it persuadable?
There, okay, the lady up in the back there, on the right. Yes. Yes, yeah.
Thank you. I really had a question I wanted to ask. I'm wondering why we're not concentrating our efforts on overturning the ban in the military. Because when Canada overturned their ban, then the gays were allowed to marry, and that became a federal law, which then it was incorporated in the provinces, and it was a no-brainer that marriage was allowed. And I know Bill Clinton, when he instituted the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, the president can no longer integrate the military like Truman did. But Obama could put a moratorium on discharging gays and lesbians because we're in a state of war. So why aren't we concentrating our efforts on that area, which is then federal, instead of all of these states where so much money goes into these little states, which really, if I get gay marriage in California and I cross the state line, then it's not recognized.
So I could talk for about 2.5 hours in response to that question, and I may. Let me say a couple of things. First and foremost, I've spent actually a lot of my professional career working on the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. That and marriage equality are the two big LGBT issues that I've contributed my efforts to. The Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy is a fantastic example of the toxic sort of received wisdom in Washington about the political viability of LGBT issues, because the polling on the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, is phenomenal. We've had general population polling numbers, general public polling numbers in the high 60s to the low mid 70% of Republicans in Indiana and independents in Texas who think that Texas is its own sovereign nation. Like 75% of the general American public thinks that gay and lesbian and bisexual people should be allowed to serve openly in the military. And I actually work very closely with Representative Patrick Murphy in the House, who is one of the extraordinary rising stars in the House of Representatives and who is taking the lead on championing the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the House of Representatives. And I think that you're right, that there is a great deal of symbolic importance, in addition to the obvious, both the importance to the men and women who are serving in the military and the national security implications, which are serious. Military service is bound up with ideas of citizenship in people's minds, and this has been true. This was true when we desegregated the military in terms of racial segregation. It was true when we incorporated women into the general command structure of the military instead of having a separate command structure for women. And it will be true, I believe, of LGBT folks. I shouldn't do that once again. It's an important distinction. Transgender folks and equality in the military is a very separate issue for transgender folks. But LGBT folks will, I believe, attain an important and publicly recognized mark of citizenship when we get rid of this awful, awful, awful policy. There is a lack of national organizing outside of the core groups that are really focusing on the issue. A group called Service Members United, a group called Service Members Legal Defense Fund, and more recently HRC has taken a more active role on the policy. And I think that has in part to do with class, frankly. I think that there are some real class biases that people bring to viewing the military as something that impacts upon them personally or not. As far as the Obama administration is concerned, the question of what Obama should be trying to do as commander-in-chief in advance of a legislative repeal is, I think, a genuinely complicated one. And I don't want to sound like I'm trying to let the president off the hook. But you have to answer the question, what would it do politically to the effort to repeal this statute if Obama were to try to use his stop-loss authority to immediately halt discharges? And I think that's a very hard question to answer. And there are plenty of folks who need to be participants in a successful repeal of this policy who have made a lot of noise to the effect that this would be a call for battle lines to form up and for consensus to fall apart on the effort to repeal this policy. And as much as I hate it, and I've been working on this policy for a dozen years, and I've represented service members, and I've been involved in litigation, and I've devoted a lot of my scholarship to this issue. And when the Dan Choys and the Victor Fehrenbachs are getting discharged, it's an outrage, it's a travesty. But I also know that Jim Webb, senator from Virginia, and Blanche Lincoln, senator from Arkansas, and others, Democrats who we need to be part of this effort, are out there making all of these noises about, well, we are not comfortable getting behind this repeal unless the Pentagon is very squarely behind that effort.
But
now, we shouldn't accept that explanation for why there's a political sort of hard lift here. The fact that the president is strongly behind this repeal should be enough of an answer for any legislator about the question of where the Pentagon is. But it's also the case that we can't ignore the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is that if we don't have the votes of these Democrats who we need to have on this repeal effort, it's not going to happen. And the safety and security of LGBT folks in the military under a stop loss, when you have a resistant command structure and a resistant Pentagon who feel like this is being imposed upon them, is a serious question. And let me tell you the distinction between the formal legal status of LGBT folks in the military and what actually happens to them on the ground in their relations with their fellow service members and their command structure. And once again, I'm not saying that it's not to be considered that Obama should do this, but it is a much harder question than people usually give it credit for, because not just the repeal effort politically, but the safety of these folks in the military is very much dependent upon their having the support of their command structure. And alienating the command structure would not serve them well. And so, and this is the conversation we should be having. And to get back to your original, I told you I could talk for 2.5 hours. I'll stop in a second. But to get back to your original observation, I do think that when we repeal the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, and I believe that we will, we're very close to having the number of sponsors we need in the House. We don't know yet what the picture is going to look like in the Senate because we don't have a bill in the Senate yet. And so members of the Democratic caucus have not been forced to step up to the plate and actually start saying where they stand on a repeal. I think that we can repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell inside of about 1.5 years if we continue a really focused effort. And I think that will have a big impact upon the growing national perception of the citizenship status of gay and lesbian folks. And so your basic instinct, I think, is an important one.
But can you just clarify for me, do you get the right then to marry in the military? If they repeal the ban, like in Canada, then they could marry, and then
no, those are
the civilian population?
No, those are two very separate issues. And in fact, the federal government, this is, I guess, a good note to end on, the federal government, in fact, doesn't and probably couldn't have anything directly to say about who's allowed to get married and who doesn't. The Supreme Court has talked about the division of authority between state legislatures and Congress. What the federal government can do is to get out of the way and to not deny benefits and discriminate against couples who are allowed to get married under state law. And both repealing DOMA for everybody and then getting rid of the military policy, which denies, among many other things, equal treatment to the partners of LGBT folks in the military, are very important instances of getting federal discriminatory law out of the way so that couples who are allowed to get married in states like Iowa, California, Connecticut will be able to enjoy the full benefits of being married. Absolutely.
So please join me in thanking our guests joining us here tonight.